What is up everyone, I am CBMR Productions, and today's video is quite the interesting one. I had quite the epiphany a few days ago. I went on Instagram and looked up the account of one Vin Diesel, as one does of course because his Instagram page is quite the piece of work.
I'm giving you big hugs in a second. I'm doing it live. I'm doing it live. I'll give big hugs in a second. I'm doing it live.
But I did see one of his most recent posts being yet another tribute to Paul Walker, his longtime co-star and friend, who sadly lost his life 9 years ago, and Vin is still grieving in his loss. It was a very touching post, and my mind automatically went to the ending of Furious 7. You know, where Vin Diesel and Paul Walker are driving side by side and eventually just split apart, saying their goodbyes as you hear "See You Again" by Charlie Puth and Wiz Khalifa in the background. A very emotional ending to that film, and then I realized how satisfying it was if it would have been the final film in the Fast and Furious franchise. Like, really think about the ending of Furious 7, look at where all of our characters are at by the end of that movie. Brian's happy with his family with Mia, Vin and Letty are all happy together, all the other members of the Fast family are living their best lives, Charles incarcerated presumably for the rest of his life considering the death of Han and countless others in his actions. And there were really no loose ends left at the end of that movie in my opinion that really warranted another follow-up film. But Hollywood is Hollywood and money talks, and we got another one, and another one, and another one, and more to come. And it really made me think, when should movie franchises be over? When is it time to close the book on a franchise, at least for a little bit, and let sleeping dogs lie? When should a story precede the box office receipts to continue warranting another installment of a franchise that has clearly met its peak? Well, today we're going to discover that. There are several franchises that have suffered this issue for over the decades, and there are a couple recent ones that had their so-called final conclusions this year. I just want to cover all of them piece by piece and really just delve into this issue layer by layer and really discover when should movie franchises be over. One example of this is the most recent Jurassic World film, Jurassic World Dominion. One of the so-called final chapter movies that I talked about earlier in the video that came out that was marketed as the final film of the Jurassic saga. The film that was meant to not only tie in the loose ends from the Jurassic World trilogy starring Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard, but also bring back all of the original cast members from that original Jurassic Park film from 1993, and give everyone a satisfying endgame style conclusion to this entire Jurassic Park franchise. And what did we get in return? Fucking locusts. Jurassic World Dominion is a very interesting piece of just how you drop the ball with a final conclusion. It's a film that really retcons a lot of stuff in this franchise to make the plot work, despite the fact that the entire previous Jurassic World movie was all about setting up this final film to make it feel less contrived, and they completely focus on the wrong things. The thing that frustrated me most about the entire movie, beyond the locusts and all the contrivances to get our characters together, was the ending of the movie. See dinosaurs and humans coexisting together on Earth, living peacefully amongst one another, felt completely wrong for this franchise, due to the fact that it completely destroys and really undermines the entire message of the original Jurassic Park film, and to extent the novel as well by Michael Crichton. The original Jurassic Park film was all about creation and evolution, questioning whether you should play God. If you have the tools necessary, should you bring back something extinct? Bring something back from the dead that should clearly be buried. And the pessimism is one of the many examples that we see in the film, most prominently by Jeff Goldblum's Ian Malcolm, especially in that whole iconic lunch scene whenever he's just talking about how Hammond, before he knew what he had, slapped on a plastic lunchbox and shipped it off. Just because he could doesn't mean you should. A bunch of these questions really interestingly brought up in the film by the amazing screenplay by David Koepp and the amazing direction by Steven Spielberg that managed to make the film feel more organic and feel more layered than just your typical summer blockbuster. But quickly after that, the franchise evolved into exactly what its antithesis was, just dumb blockbusters. And as the sequels went on, it felt like every single sequel strayed further and further from the path of the original movie. Despite I feel like the first Jurassic World was a fun, dumb blockbuster, it had none of the stakes and none of the creativity that the original Jurassic Park film had. And especially now seeing the conclusion of this arc, really kind of just does undermine the entire message of the film. The entire first film was about not letting dinosaurs out on the mainland. It was about not letting dinosaurs become the brand new species because it would become the top dominant dog in the food chain. There's a reason why dinosaurs became extinct, especially since every single sequel in this franchise has really kind of reinforced that message, even up to Fallen Kingdom, that these dinosaurs are dangerous beings. Sure, there are some nice ones, but by and large, these dinosaurs should be extinct and should not be roaming around because they are dangerous predators. And we've seen numerous times, from seeing the T-Rex storm San Diego in Lost World, to seeing that scene in the first Jurassic World where the pterodactyls were just clawing up humans like pieces of popcorn, that these things are dangerous wild animals and should be hunted down at all costs. So when the final reel of the film really just kind of like retcons and kind of contradicts the entire point of this franchise, and questions why even do another film in the first place. And even knowing the ending of this movie, we know there's gonna be more coming. The exact same thing I can say about another movie that came out earlier this year that was the supposed final chapter of a franchise, and that being Halloween Ends. The very controversial Halloween Ends, I might add. Once again, another final conclusion against Laurie Strode and Jamie Lee Curtis against Michael Myers. Meant to end off this timeline of the David Gordon Green trilogy beginning since 2018. Meant to be very, very, anticipated, very hyped, and it ended up really, really disappointing a lot of fans. Although I do appreciate some aspects of Halloween Ends, it felt very foreign to the previous two movies in this trilogy, both stylistically and script-wise. Many of the characters we focus on in the first two movies kind of felt like sidelined in this final chapter to focus on an entirely new character that pretty much amounted to nothing by the final act, and then just evolved itself into the marketing campaign of just seeing Laurie Strode and Michael Myers fight one last time. Despite this being like the 7th or 8th film in this entire Halloween franchise to focus on Laurie Strode and Michael Myers fighting each other, I mean really look at it in perspective. We had the original Halloween film, Halloween 2, Halloween H2O, Halloween Resurrection, both the Rob Zombie movies, and this entire David Gordon Green trilogy. Like man, this dude's a fucking simp for Laurie Strode. But to me, similar to Jurassic World Dominion, it's a film that just feels like it's just running out of gas and feels like it has no ideas left in the tank. It is widely known that before this trilogy was a thing, David Gordon Green and one of the writers, the famous Danny McBride, pitched 2 instead of 3 films to Jason Blum to kind of round out and make their own little trilogy in and of themselves, instead of making a 3rd movie. But because of greed, they stretched out way too many ideas that could have been better in a 1-2 punch film like it was originally meant to be on one night with Halloween 2018 and Halloween Kills, and stretched out these ideas way too much to the point where they had to make some gigantic retcons and some gigantic leaps to make you understand why Michael Myers is surviving this entire night, like making every single human being in Halloween feel like a complete idiot in Halloween Kills to make sure Michael Myers survives or Halloween Ends, or to have him be wrestled to the ground by a teenager, and then have him just be killing up more people than Michael Myers does in this final chapter. And I do genuinely believe had Halloween 2018 and Halloween Kills just been a 1-2 punch instead of being a part of a trilogy, I felt like it would have been a better, satisfying experience overall. And that's an example where they just took a half measure and just decided to really stretch out all these ideas and just make a compromised product as a result. And in my opinion, after seeing Halloween Ends, nothing really screams at me to rewatch this film or its entire David Gordon Green trilogy. To me, my Halloween canon timeline is Halloween, Halloween 2, and Halloween H2O. Sure, you can argue Halloween Resurrection all you want at me, but honestly, I don't even consider that to be a real movie. That's more of just a parody thing that they just paid Jamie Lee Curtis to be in for 10 minutes. But Halloween H2O just got it right. It told one last story of Laurie Strode and Michael Myers, and it didn't meander for 3 movies. It told a simple story under 90 minutes, told some really good characters, and gave us a definitive ending by seeing Michael Myers' head being chopped off, and that's to me just a more satisfying conclusion to Michael Myers' story than whatever they did with Halloween Ends. And again, because of greed, they just brought Jamie Lee Curtis back for like another 3 movies, and to me they just focused way too much on the safe bet on Jamie Lee Curtis than just exploring more ideas with this franchise. Another example of really bad retconning is of course with Star Wars in the sequel trilogy. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Star Wars, nor am I super close to the material, so I'm not someone who is inherently really pissed off of the retcons and the changes in The Last Jedi, but knowing how much all that stuff would be later retconned with Rise of Skywalker, it does feel worse as a result just because it clearly showed that Rian Johnson just wanted to just subvert expectations, not really set up a whole lot for a 3rd movie. And to me, the fact that Disney did not even have a roadmap, despite the fact they paid $4 billion for this IP, is absolutely baffling in my opinion. Especially regarding the writing in Rise of Skywalker of how Palpatine returns, just literally there's no definitive explanation of how Palpatine came back by literally falling out into space. Feels like a child wrote the entire script, and it really just compromised the previous 6 movies of Anakin's arc, because at the end of the day, sure there was peace for decades, but the fact that Palpatine wasn't even defeated by Anakin, and the fact he just comes back out of nowhere just because they have no ideas left in the tank, does compromise the previous movies in my opinion. And that's kind of like the worst example of when a franchise needs to be over, is when you compromise the previous movies and make them worse in retrospect. Same thing I talked about with Halloween Resurrection earlier, it makes Halloween H2O worse because it completely undermines the entire point of that movie. And this entire sequel trilogy of Star Wars, and although I'm not the first one to say it, just feels like Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams are just in the boxing match trying to see who can retcon the most decisions in each other's movies. And it doesn't feel like a cohesive conclusion, and just doesn't feel like a natural part of this entire Skywalker saga. One franchise that does get to have its cake and eat it too though is of course with the MCU. Avengers Endgame was a film that managed to get it right, in my opinion, with being able to end off a giant era of this entire Marvel Cinematic Universe by being able to close out the book for several of these iconic Avengers like Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Natasha Romanoff. But the fact they had so many Avengers left in the tank like Black Panther, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, that could take over the mantles from these heroes in some way, shape, or form, they were able to have room to expand with future phases, but also give out proper conclusions to the characters that have built this universe since the beginning. And no matter what you think about the film itself, it was shown that it has a major success, and even looking at Phase 4 and the upcoming Phase 5 and 6, a major part of Marvel fatigue right now is because Endgame to so many people was just so satisfying that people don't really want to see more after Endgame because they really haven't felt like the product has been that great since then. But my main point is saying is that Endgame managed to get it right by being able to conclude its own story, but have a natural way out to continue further products. Like I talked about so many of these other franchises, their main issues is that they have such a great ending in some of these installments like Halloween H2O or Furious 7, and because they had such a phenomenal closing, these studio heads and these writers are tasked with trying to continue on a franchise that they simply just don't know how to get their way out of, and their only example of how to get out of it is just retconning everything. Like going back to Fast and Furious, I hated F9 because it retconned so many things about the Fast and Furious franchise. They made our characters worse as a result. Like the whole thing about Dom just abandoning his brother for decades on end, just because he had a suspicion about his brother through a rumor through a couple of his buddies in prison, makes Dom such a worse character because he's all about family and he just drops his brother over one rumor. Despite that it was clearly laid out of how Dom's father was killed in the original Fast and Furious movie. And of course the whole retconning with Han, just sincerely being the most ridiculous and just the most frustrating retcon in this entire franchise. Just having him not even be in the car crash in Tokyo Drift, he wasn't even injured in the car crash. It was all set by Kurt Russell, just so they can bring back Sung Kang, was just such a ridiculous move in my opinion. Although I do love Han as a character, it's just because they shot themselves in the foot with that movie, and they had to find some bullshit way to bring him back. Very similar to how Elise was killed in the first Insidious movie and they had to write her back in by having her be an apparition or just do prequels for the rest of the franchise. It felt like that, but in my opinion, it just really undermines the whole, even though Fast and Furious is not a very suspenseful franchise, it completely undermines the entire suspense and stakes of this entire franchise. Especially going at post-credits scene and seeing Han and Shaw face it off, trying to tease like some giant thing about justice for Han or whatever, and it's just like, why should I care about Han? He wasn't even injured in the wreck. Like, it just undermines the entire suspension of the franchise. One of the worst examples of retconning in my opinion is the entire Saw franchise. I mean, we have a 10th movie in development right now set to come out next year, and one of the biggest jokes about the franchise is about how much they retconned with every single sequel. Damn near every single installment brought a new apprentice to Jigsaw and a new member of his Jigsaw gang, and just showing how much John Kramer just thought 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and that he just knew perfectly how to place every single piece of every single character from every single sequel. And with a character that's just so meticulous and so just higher than everyone else, the fact when he does have flaws and the fact that, you know, something happens like his wife being killed in the final chapter of the franchise, it just contradicts the entire character. If you want to have a character that's smarter than everyone else, fine, just at least be consistent with the character. Don't let his wife be killed by one of his, you know, apprentices that he knew was a traitor from the beginning. He set him up on the path. And if that was the case, why did you even let him in your circle? It's just a ridiculous thing. But by and large, when should movie franchises be over? When should they end? When should they tip their hat and say goodbye? To my opinion, it's very obvious with the multiple examples I've shown in this video. It's really when the franchise has no viable ideas left in the tank, at least for a little bit. It's when a story is completely closed the book and shouldn't be continued just based on greed. Because when you beat a dead horse, eventually there's nothing left to go for. So many franchises suffer from the same issue of just having a great ending or just having a good story that can feel contained as a solo movie that gets stretched out again and again and again just for the sake of profits. And at the end of the day, just makes a compromised product that just makes the film itself worse as well as making previous movies worse. Not saying a franchise when it has a certain ending like Avengers Endgame or any of the franchises I've been talking about, that they should be over and they should never have another installment ever again, but there should be a time and a place for every single franchise to take a rest for a few years. There is viable options, and I think there's always creative juices to jumpstart a franchise again. We've seen so many franchises come back out of the woodwork after decades of silence. I mean, look at Top Gun Maverick, that come out and really roar up the box office and are critically successful and well responded by the fans because they took the time with it and actually managed to have a story that felt cohesive and felt right to come back to the franchise. And Avatar looks like it's going to be the exact same way. Our franchise shouldn't be dormant forever. I'm looking at you, Freddy and Jason, when are you guys coming back? But it's just when the studios just beat these franchises up like a dead horse just for the sake of profit, and they just have nothing left in the tank. And sometimes, you should just let characters ride off into the sunsets. Let them have their ending. Don't bring them back just for the sake of making extra money. There are multiple other options to make movies other than just making generic sequels. And as for me, when film franchises should end.